We are doing the whole unit circle in 6-4. So you guys need to know not just the first quadrant, but all two, three, and four quadrants. So that's what you need to work on being able to know it. But if you know the left-hand rule and you know the first quadrant, then the rest is going to be pretty easy. So if you don't know the left-hand rule and if you don't know the first quadrant, then you need some work to do. So make sure you get to it immediately. Okay, so how do I do this? Well, we still know that this one here is the x-axis and this one here is the y-axis. So that has not changed. And the quadrants are still the same. So we know that this is the first quadrant. And in order for us to start, we always start standard position is always going to be starting at the x-axis, so at 0 degrees. So at 0 degrees is going to be, and then we're going to either rotate, um, we're either going to go rotate counterclockwise or clockwise. If we do counterclockwise, we know it's going to be positive. If we do clockwise, it's going to be negative. So counterclockwise positive, clockwise negative. So in quadrant one, we know that it still has an x and a y, and that x is still going to be, all the x terms are going to be positive, all the y terms are going to be also positive because they're to the left and then they're above the x-axis. So we know they're going to be positive, but we don't call them x and y anymore. So what we do call them is the x is going to be the cosine. So we know that that's going to be the cosine. And then this one here is going to be the sine of that. Notice how I put the angle in there. Please do not write SIN or COS. You need to have that symbol in there. So once we know that this one here, the square root of 3 over 2, represents that at the angle of 30 degrees is going to be the square root of 3 over 2 trig ratio for cosine, the trig function, three terms that we need. So if we look at this, we already know that that was all a review. Standard form starts at 0 degrees, and then we're going to continue going counterclockwise. So after 90, what comes next? How do I fill in the rest of the unit circle? And the way that you do is that it's actually symmetric. So if I fold it along the y-axis, this triangle is going to fold right on top of that triangle. So if I look at it, I am going to have this triangle right here because they're mirror images. And if this here is 30 degrees, then this here is 30 degrees. So they are mirror images on both sides. I fold along it, it looks exactly the same. So what does that mean? That means that I am going to use the same information that's over here. So if it's the cosine of 30 is the square root of 3 over 2, then the cosine of 30 over here is also the square root of 3 over 2. So if I'm looking at that, I am just going to put that in there, is the square root of 3 over 2. Um, and actually, I'm going to take that away and put it in this color. So it's going to be the square root of 3 over 2. And then this one here is still the sine of 30. It doesn't change no matter what quadrant it's in. It's still going to be 1/2. So if you're saying, well, why is that the same thing? Well, because it's still the same triangle with the same length of sides and the same angle. And so they're the same values. But because they fall in the second quadrant, that's where we have to look at it. So we're now in the second quadrant. We are no longer in the first quadrant. So something has to change. And what does change is the actual sign. So in this case here, the cosine is negative, but the sine is positive. So the only thing that changes here is that that is going to be negative and that's going to be positive, but it's exactly the same thing. These are called reference triangles. So these are called reference triangles. And reference angles, but mainly it's the reference triangles that we're talking about. So we're going to use a reference angle. And it follows the same thing throughout the whole thing. So the 45 and the 45, if I were to draw it, it would look exactly the same. So if I were to drop that down and do the same thing here and drop that down and do the same thing here, it would not change. So we know that this one here is going to be the square root of 2 over 2, square root of 2 over 2. The only difference is that that one is negative, and then this one here is going to be 1/2, and this one's going to be square root of 3 over 2. And so this one here is going to be negative. So they are the same mirror images on both sides. That's going to be 1/2. But how are we going to tell you that it's in the second quadrant? That's where the little things change, and that's where we start counting. So in this case here, I know that from 0 all the way to here, we're going to have 180 degrees because it's a straight angle. So I know that this is 180. So I know that this angle here is going to be 180 degrees. And so what is this angle going to be? Well, it's 180 minus 30. So I know that this one here is going to be 150 degrees because we're here and this is 30 degrees. So we subtract that because now it's the angle, the standard position angle from here all the way to there is going to be 150. And then the next one is 45. So we're going to subtract 45 from 180 and I get 120, 35 degrees. And then we subtract 60 from it, and I get 120 degrees. So each one we're subtracting the corresponding angle. We subtract 30 from 180, then we subtract 45, then we subtract 60, and now we have the second quadrant. And I know that at 180, this point right here is that the y value is going to be 0, but the x value is going to be -1, which is what is on the other side, but negative. So, and that's how you fill the second quadrant. And then the third quadrant is very similar. So we know that we're in the third quadrant there. And so we know we're in the third quadrant, and in the third quadrant, we have that it's going to be negative, negative. And so when we do that, we're doing the same triangle. So we still have a reference triangle. So now it's sort of going to be mirror image to this. And so we know that this angle right there is going to be 30 degrees as well. And that's our reference triangle. It's 30 degrees. And so it's going to have the same features as those. And so it's same 30 here, 30 there, and 30 here is going to be the angle that is going to happen. And let's see, we know that this one here is going to be the square root of 3 over 2. This is going to be 1/2. And then just let's fill in the fourth quadrant as well, because we know that that's going to be a reference angle of 30 degrees as well there. So that's going to look like that. And that's also going to be 30 degrees. And so notice how the reference angles are always off the x-axis because they're the mirror images and they're never off the y-axis. So anytime you're calculating something, it's going to be just from the x-axis. And people actually look at it and say, well, look at that. What does it actually look like? It looks like a bow tie. So the angles are always off the x-axis. You're never going to use them off the y-axis, and that's a very common mistake. So knowing and filling this one in, it's also going to be the square root of 3 over 2, and then this is also going to be 1/2. The only thing that's going to be the difference is that this one here is going to be negative, and that's going to be negative because it's in the third quadrant, and then this one here is going to be where the x-axis is going to be positive, but the y-axis is below, so that's going to be negative. So that's the only thing that's changing. So notice how they're all the same. The only thing that's changing is the quadrant, the sign of where it's actually falling in. And so the other square root angles, all the other angles are going to have the trig ratios. This is going to be square root of 2 over 2, square root of 2 over 2, square root of 2 over 2, square root of 2 over 2. This one's going to be 1/2 square root of 3 over 2, 1/2 square root of 3 over 2, and then we just change the sign. So these are both going to be negative, negative, negative. This one's going to be negative, and that's going to be negative. And then for this one here, it's similar to this one. So it's going to be 0, 1, but the sign is the one that's going to change to negative. And so that's how you fill it in. How do we fill in the angles? Well, the angles are going to be similar. And so now we have 180. And if I keep going further, I'm adding 30 degrees. So when I add 30 degrees to 180, I get 210. And then I add then 180 plus 45. That's going to be 225. And then I add 180 to 60 and I get 240. And this is a quadrantal angle, so it's going to be 90, 180, and then this one here is 270. And so, how do I do the quadrant over here? We don't keep adding to the 180. You could, but it's a little bit more difficult on there. What I would suggest you do is then you subtract it because doing 270, this one here is going to be 360 degrees because that's once around the unit circle. And so then this one here is going to be 360 minus 30. So that's going to be 330. And then 360 minus 45. So that's going to be 315. And then do it again, minus 60, and that's going to give you 300. And so those are all the degrees going once around the circle. And these are the angles that you're going to need to know them, but you're going to use reference triangles and then be able to figure that out using reference triangles, any quadrant, and anything that you have on there. And that's the unit circle. Very good.